Good evening, everyone, and we're very happy to see you here this evening. Welcome to our first hybrid meeting of the Native Plant Project. My name is Jan Miller, and I am the new president. And this year we decided to offer what we call a hybrid meeting. That means that we're having our live programs as well as virtual programs by Zoom for Native Plant Project members. And so you're all part of history for us. It's really good to be up and running again after our hiatus for COVID. And we really appreciate that y'all were willing to come out and spend the evening with us. The Native Plant Project turned 40 years old this year. It was founded in April of 1982 with the purpose of protecting and conserving native plants and their endangered habitat in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and to promote and use in local landscaping and revegetation efforts. Many very dedicated men and women, some who are no longer with us, devoted hours, countless hours in the fields, collecting information about our native plants. And after they collected this information, they went on to share it with us. And along with sharing their information, they also shared their passion for native plants. So we hope to continue their legacy going forward. Okay, our speaker for this evening is John Brush. He's the urban ecologist for the City of McAllen, and he spends most of his time at Quinta, Mazatlan, where he oversees the rewilding restoration projects. He also develops community partnerships, gives educational programs, and serves as park naturalist. He received his Master of Science in Biology from University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in 2016, studying how suburban bird communities are influenced by environmental variables. John has been a leader in the effort to promote and study our native flora by being an administrator for the very active Facebook group, Native Plants of the Rio Grande Valley. And this group currently has a membership of 2,461. Another of John's projects is the City Nature Challenge, which is sponsored by iNaturalist and other local nature groups. So I'm very happy to present our speaker for this evening, John Brush.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, so just real briefly, I started off mostly paying attention to birds in my childhood, and I still definitely love birds. But starting in undergraduate, I started taking as many plant courses at UT Pan Am as I could, and I really fell in love with learning about plants. And it's morphed into trying to encourage folks, and on my own time and at work, experimenting with using native plants in different contexts and in different settings. So I'm learning as I go. So I don't want to come across as like expert person, because I'm not. I'm just someone who's enthusiastic about it. Oh yeah, that's fine. So why plant? Well, number one, for beauty, just looking at the incredible diversity of native flowers on some of our native plants here in the region. They are beautiful in and of themselves. Other parts of the plants are beautiful, from the fruits to the bark to the leaf structure, to looking at plants in their communities, right? To looking at a snippet of thorn forest here and seeing how mesquites and granjeno and lotebush and all these other thorn forest species weave together to form this just dense, thick forest that's incredibly difficult to traverse through. To seeing wildflowers along roadsides or in empty fields, plants truly are beautiful, and they also beautify our communities as well. So this is a native landscaping project that was done in El Paso, Texas, by the landscape architects Tenaikla, and they transformed parts of UTEP into being so much more beautiful and resilient spaces using native plants than these asphalt barren wastelands, right? So this, just full of cars and concrete, into a walkable space for students. So not only are these plants just beautiful in and of themselves, beautiful as communities, but they're also beautiful in the context of making our spaces more livable for people, and then also the focus of this program for wildlife as well. Other ecosystem services that plants provide us, besides just that beauty, they're of course cleaning our air. So I did a tree canopy assessment for McAllen a few years back, and that estimate showed that they remove about 210 tons of air pollution every year. That's just the city trees in McAllen. They purify our water and help with water management systems. So if you have more trees, you tend to have slower amounts of rainfall hitting the soil, hitting asphalt. So that slows things down, entering into our water management systems, and can help mitigate flooding. Also allows infiltration down into our ground soils a little bit easier. Perhaps most importantly for the valley is having trees and having native vegetation also really helps us cool our cities as well. So cities tend to be hotter than their surrounding environment. This is the urban heat island effect. And trees are one way that we can try to mitigate that. They cool down by shading, by evapotranspiration. That has not only just physical benefits for people, but also monetary benefits in that you're reducing as much the amount of AC that you're using, and so forth. I love heat maps that show where vegetated areas are and how warm they are. So in this one, this is in Canada, but you can see the green here in this image. The green is parks and recreational spaces. So these are the spaces that are dominated by trees and other vegetation. And then the lighter the pink, the cooler the temperature. So you can just see the real correlation there between these vegetative spaces and being, between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius cooler than like the downtown pure asphalt and concrete and metal spaces. And then they also promote better health for us as well. They help reduce stress and anxiety. I know that this was something I think a lot of people experienced during the throes of the pandemic, increased stress and anxiety, but being outside and doing gardening, there's a lot of research out there that shows that it helps with those things. Boosts our mood, and it also has been shown to help improve learning in children when they have access to nature and access to green spaces. And then the main purpose of this talk, also plant for wildlife. So without plants, we're not going to be having the plain chachalakas or these bee flies or tortoise beetles or deer or saucy beauty moths, green snakes. This is Halictus legatus, three-furrowed bee, sweat bee, queens, nesting spaces for birds, right? And we're going to delve more into this. But there's also more of a personal connection too, for when you plant something or when you grow something, and the first time you see a bee or a butterfly or a bird using that plant, it just comes to life even more. So this was a little megachilid bee that was using one of the Cowpen daisies that I grew in my yard. And even though I also have robber bee flies that eat the bees that come to my cowpens, it's sad for the bees, great for the robber flies. But it shows that you can create interactions, spaces for these animals to interact as an ecosystem in places that you are also occupying. So why native plants in particular, right? This is something that you probably have seen inundated from a lot of conservation organizations is why are we specifically always emphasizing what are we calling native plants? But before we get into that, I wanted to go through some definitions of what native plants are. And then we're going to touch on some stuff here in a second. But the USDA has it as a plant that is part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And they emphasize that the word native should always be used in terms of qualifying a place, right? It's native to the Rio Grande Valley, native to Central Texas, native to Western Texas. National Wildlife Federation, oh, they also add in that it's only plants found in this country before European settlement. Take note of that. National Wildlife Federation has a native plant, a plant is considered native if it occurred naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction. Texas Parks and Wildlife, plants that have evolved and are naturally occurring in an area or a region that are adapted to the existing soil and climatic conditions. There are some issues with some of these definitions, right? Number one is the separation of people from nature, right? Yes, we move plants around, but we are also part of nature. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. Two, it ignores indigenous peoples, which were spreading and using plants long before modern science, quote unquote, knew where they were. Look no further than things like the mescal bean or the Texas mountain laurel, which was used, or prickly pear were used a ton. And we know that Native American peoples were traveling around, sometimes very long distances. Assuredly, they were moving plants with them. And we know that they cultivated and domesticated plants. Great example of it as well is the century plant, which are two main resources that we like to use to determine what's native and versus not native disagree. The USDA has it where they're native, and BONAP, the Biota of North America program, only has them as native in Texas, but not in other parts. Who are we to say when or where these populations of century plants came from, right? And so that brings us to another issue, which is arbitrary delineations. How far back do we go? How site specific do we go? This is a Montezuma cypress from Edinburgh campus of UT Rio Grande Valley by the Education Building. Do we know that they're historically Montezuma cypress in that exact location? Typically they're along rivers or resakas. I don't think there was a river or resaka there. So do we count that as native or not, right? And how will plant distributions change going forward, looking at climate change and how there's going to be movement of plant species. And if they can't move, they're gonna go, some are gonna go extinct. And then scientific uncertainty. So there's not that much botanical knowledge before the 1800s. So I just say all this just to clarify that there are some issues with determining what qualifies as native versus non-native. And it's just something to keep in mind. But I still emphasize the use of native plants, quote unquote, even with all that said. And I do it for three different reasons. One, their value to local wildlife. Two, their practicality given local climate conditions, right? Why am I going to bring a plant from some temperate environment elsewhere that is not going to make it through 3 months of 95 to 100 degrees and no rain, right? Doesn't make much sense on just a practical standpoint. And then three, trying to celebrate our space and being humble in that, right? To where there's a lot of cool plants that are here in the valley, and why not use them and celebrate them in our spaces more than we currently do? So to me, they matter because they are living organisms, one, and two, for the purposes and the roles that they fill in our ecosystems. So let's talk about some of the value of plants for wildlife. And I've kind of separated this into some direct benefits versus indirect benefits. So some direct benefits, right? Animals using plants directly for food or for some other purposes. So pollinators going to plants to gather nectar, to gather pollen, to feed themselves and to feed their offspring. This is a Mexican feather tongue bee on the upper right. And one of the plants that it likes a lot are passion vines. It really likes the stinking passion vine, Passiflora fotida. And then hummingbirds and Turk's cap have a pretty tight relationship as well. Hummingbirds by far are the best pollinators of Turk's cap compared to bees and butterflies and other things. So you don't have those hummingbirds, you're not going to have that plant be able to reproduce as efficiently. And then the hummingbirds aren't also going to have the food source available. And of course, this can impact us through pollinators of our crops. And then there's also frugivore plant relationships that are very important for healthy ecosystems. So birds, like the northern mockingbird or like the tropical kingbird, both love to eat fleshy fruited berries like anaqua fruits, Brazil trees, and are dispersing those out into the environment as they fly around. So they're maintaining that genetic diversity for those plant populations. And they're also, in fact, spreading and creating habitat for other organisms if those plants fall in a place where they can germinate and grow. There was even a study, I went to the Society for Ecological Restoration meeting a few years ago in Wisconsin, and there was a study where they were looking at how effectively they could use frugivorous birds to help reforest tropical environments that had been clear cut. And so what they did is they went out and they put perches, artificial perches in these empty fields. And so the birds would come and they'd perch on them and they'd poop out the fruits they'd been eating in nearby patches of forest. And areas where they had birds land had much more plant diversity, and those plants germinated faster and established themselves faster than if they had just let it go, right? So birds really can play an important role for bringing back habitats. Other direct benefits, things like javelinas love to dig around and root up plants and eat their tubers or eat cacti and things. This is not one that was digging up something to eat. It was just taking a nice cool mud or a soil bath there. Rabbits eating the plants themselves. And then you have animals that use plants for their homes. So this is not a hooded oriole. This is a bronzed cowbird in a hooded oriole nest, but hooded orioles love to nest in sable palm trees. So they'll use the fibers from the tree to weave a nest in the palm fronds that they may have even gathered the fibers from. And then this down here is evidence of a bee using plants for its nest. And megachilid bees or leafcutter bees will go around and cut these small circles out of plants and roll up a pollen burrito, stick it in a hole in a tree, and that's what their young feed off of. So there's a lot of direct benefits for wildlife. And then there's a lot of indirect benefits for wildlife as well. And what I mean by indirect is things that aren't directly eating the plants themselves are eating the insects that are eating the plants, right? So Doug Tallamy is kind of probably one of the people on the forefront of studying the effect of native plants on wildlife. And he's got the great quote, insects are the oxygen that drive ecosystems. So most insects do specialize on certain plant families or plant genre, or sometimes even specific species. And even with generalist insects, so things that are able to use plants in sometimes very different families. For instance, they might use sunflowers as a host plant, and then they may also use like something in the cedar elm family, right? Even them, they typically are more sustained by native plants than non-native plants. So if we replace local flora with unrelated, unfamiliar species, the tendency is that we're going to reduce animal diversity. And there's a lot of research and literature. This is just a small snippet that I called up in 15 minutes today, and some things that I had saved. If you want to look through, take a photo of this afterwards, you can. There's some cool reading in there. Fortunately for us, if we want to use native plants, we have a lot of different things we can choose from. Roughly 1,400 plant species native to our 4-county region. And of course, our diversity is largely due to our location, We have temperate influences. We have Western desert influences. We've got the coast once you get over into Cameron County and Willacy County. And then we're fairly close to the tropics. If you just drive south into Mexico, at some point as you're driving south through Tamaulipas, you're gonna cross this yellow ball, at least it was there when I was a kid, this yellow ball on the side of the road. And that was the sign that you'd crossed the Tropic of Cancer. And you're officially, quote unquote, in the tropics. And it was only like maybe an hour or two down south. Cool paper by Lonard and Judd, who are both at UT Pan Am, kind of show the affiliations of some of our different woody plant species. So we have a lot of plants in common with Mexico, and then, well, woody plants in particular. And we have a lot of woody plants in common with southwestern deserts. So if you go around and look at the plant species that you're seeing, you know, at Benson or Santa Ana, or if you get out to the Salt Lakes, as you go west, you'll probably see similar things. And as you go south, you'll probably see similar things as well. So when I talk about using native plants for wildlife, what I really mean is we want to create suitable habitat for wildlife, right? So we want to provide the things that an organism needs to survive and reproduce, right? This is pretty basic, but you know, food, water, shelter, places to raise their young, that's the typical four that you hear associated with habitat. But habitat is a relative term. And what's good habitat for one organism isn't necessarily going to be good habitat for the other organism. And so here's an example, a local example of that. Tropical parulas in the upper left there used to occupy the tall riparian forests along the river and along Resacas. They love being in places that have tall trees with tillandsia or the Spanish moss hanging from it. They love that sort of habitat. That's good habitat for them. The common yellowthroat, on the other hand, another warbler species, so closely related to the tropical parula, wants to be in wetlands, and it wants to be in cattails and reeds and other marshland plants. So even though they're closely related, they both like to eat insects. What's good habitat for the parula is not the habitat that a common yellowthroat is going to use, and vice versa. So that's just something to consider when you're wanting to create habitat, is you have to remember it's relative depending on the organism. So never mind this confusing graph here. This is my research in a nutshell. But basically, the red bars are environmental variables, and then the four-letter codes are birds. But basically, this is just another example of how what's good for one is not good for the other. So Western kingbird, you'll notice, is almost the polar opposite of plain chachalaca down here. And this is kind of what their preferred habitats look like. So when I ran around and did bird counts in McAllen and Edinburgh, I would see chachalacas in places like Quinta, Mazatlan in the lower left there. But I'd see tropical kingbirds in neighborhoods with lots of open spaces and asphalt and small trees. So they occupy very different habitats. So in summary, not all species would like the habitat that you're planning to create. Just keep that in mind. And your habitat is impacted by local and landscape factors. So if you're next to a national wildlife refuge, for whatever reason, you're super lucky, you have a yard that goes right up against Santa Ana, your yard's probably going to be way more diverse than my yard in Edinburgh, right? Because you have something close by that is a reservoir of habitat. However, there are certain things where it's like, yeah, if you put in a sunflower, you're probably going to get a sweat bee going to your flower, one of these 3-furrowed sweat bees. Or if you put up a hummingbird feeder or hummingbird friendly plants, you're probably going to get hummingbirds because they can exist in the urban mosaic. You're not probably going to get a ocelot ever, right? Because they're only going to be in these huge tracts of land far away from cars and from people. You might get greyhawk in the lower right if your neighborhood has enough trees. Okay, so just something to keep in mind that some species, no matter how much attention and care and plant materials we put into your yard, you may not get just simply because they're looking at a broader scale than just your yard and are impacted by the neighborhood you're in and other things that are around you. So, gonna go over a few general things. One is, how do we find wildlife-friendly native plants for our area? And then I'm gonna go over one resource to look at figuring out whether these plants are gonna grow in your conditions. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of what wildlife tend to like different types of plants and different plant species. So there are a few different resources to find wildlife-friendly plants in your area. The National Wildlife Federation has a handy one where all you need to do is put in your zip code, and they will come up with a list of plant genera that are native to your area, right? So it's super easy. You just put in your zip code and things pop up. One thing to be aware for this one is that it is focused mostly on butterflies and moths. And so that does kind of change what plants that they recommend. But you can see here, they have these cool little butterfly numbers, and that's the number of moths and butterflies that are known to use that plant species. So this is a super easy resource to quickly get some native plant ideas. The National Audubon Society has a very similar one that's more focused on birds, being the National Audubon Society. But again, you just put in your zip code and it'll give you a selection of plants. So this is for my zip code. It gave me 209 plant recommendations. Gives you the common name, the scientific name, what kind of attributes the plant has, and then what kind of birds you may see going to it. So again, super easy to use, focused on birds, but it's also not comprehensive. We have far more than 209 late native plants in our area. And then we get into like the powerhouse. This is the Biota of North America program. And this one is extremely comprehensive, where it has all the native plant species here, but you kind of have to, it's not as user-friendly, and you kind of have to already know a little bit about scientific names. But what it does have is allows you to see county by county maps of what's native to different parts of the country. So this is for Prosopis, which is the mesquite tree genus. And you can see here that we've got Prosopis glandulosa and Prosopis reptans as our two native mesquite species. So that's the honey mesquite and then the tornillo, the dwarf screwbean. So the Biota of North America program, I do recommend using, but it takes a little while to get used to. If you go to this taxonomic data center at the bottom left here, there, you can actually go in and enter and filter things out by county. So you can just say Hidalgo County, and it's going to spit out a big list of plants that you can download and then look through. It's going to be overwhelming at first, but it's got everything in it. Let me skip over these. And then there's more locally regional resources that I always recommend to folks. Plants of Deep South Texas is a field guide by Ken King, who's in the room here, and Alfred Richardson. And this is the second edition, I believe. So they had, that's the first, oh, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the old book that y'all had. So they had a, okay. Anyways, Plants of Deep South Texas is a great one to have. Has beautiful color photos, gives information about the plant's growth habits, what size it is, gives cool tidbits about wildlife that use it, and some other like natural history information. And then the Native Plant Project also has some really cool handbooks, and this information is available online. And I believe they said that they do have some physical copies of some of these handbooks available as well. So if you want a physical copy, you can get them from the Native Plant Project. I still use these to this day because they're just super easy to use, and they've kind of got like a core group of plants that are frequently seen in native landscaping. And then Everett also has some different plants that are dedicated to South Texas, different books that are dedicated to South Texas. So if you want some print materials and you want some things that are more focused on the LRGV or South Texas, this would be a good way to go. Figuring out what plants will grow at your location. I pretty much only use the native plants in North America for this by the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin. For most plants, when you look it up, they're going to include these growing conditions here and tell you about water use, tell you about light requirements, tell you about soil moisture requirements. And so if you have a plant that you found through some of these other resources and you want to see if it'll actually grow in your yard, this could be a way to get some information about whether it will do well in your space or not. So if you've got a place that's mostly shade, you're going to definitely want to not put in a plant that wants full sun, right? But they do share growing conditions for some of our native plant species. And then we get into what sort of wildlife do you want to attract in your space as well. So we're going to look at some associations between different wildlife and different plant species. So if you're focused on bees, and there are a lot of bees around, I wish Ernesto Herrera was here to tell us about bees, but there are many, many different native bee species in the US and Canada, and there's plenty of them here in the Rio Grande Valley. One of my favorite things is showing people some of our native sweat bees, tiny little green glowy ones, or the bumblebee, or the large carpenter bees, or the longhorn bees, and be like, these are our bees. When before they would just think about honeybees. So there's a lot of diversity of bees out there. And for bees, it's actually pretty easy in some ways. You can just leave some weeds, essentially. So sunflowers are actually a really great resource for bees. The last house that I lived in, I transplanted some sunflowers from a local field into our backyard, and they looked really bad for a while. The sunflowers were wilted. I thought they were going to die, but eventually they took root and they got to be like 10-foot tall sunflowers. And I would see so many bees there every time I went out and looked. So all these different bees were just photographed in the span of like 15 minutes at my sunflower patch during peak. So this is a megachilid bee up here. This is a sweat bee over on the right. This is a longhorn bee with those long antennae. And then this is another type of sweat bee down there. So sunflowers, super easy. Just get some seed from the edge of a field and throw it somewhere, and you're going to have sunflowers coming up. So the sunflower family in general is great for bees, and there are many, many different plants in the sunflower family here in the valley. These are some of the most common ones. Cowpen Daisy, Cacti, skeleton leaf goldeneye, Texas thistle, and so on and so on. You can see the incredible diversity of flowers, both in terms of color and in terms of type as well, that are present in the sunflower family. My latest foray into the sunflower family is Cowpen Daisy. And this is a photo of the current house I live in. And this whole hedge, which is about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, is all Cowpen Daisy. And it has also been extremely popular with bees. And it has been blooming nonstop since like early April. And I have not watered it, basically. I watered it to get the seeds going and then just left it. And it's just been sustained on rain. And Cowpen Daisy is also extremely hardy and drought tolerant. So I've had at least 8 to 10 different species of bee in that patch, just from me like kind of walking by and taking a photo here and there. So again, megachilid bee over here, another longhorn bee right here, tiny little unidentified bee, I don't know what it is, and then some sort of alpine bee. Cacti are also really great for bees. Cacti, most of our cacti in the valley are spring and early summer bloomers. but just prickly pears are fantastic for bees, particularly the Diadasia bee. You can see one of them poking its head out of the flower on the left there. And then the Lithurgopsis bees are kind of specialized on cactus blooms. And there's a lot of other types of cacti that bees love going to as well. There's some more ground growing ones, some prostrate ones like the strawberry cactus or the ladyfinger cactus, or if you can get a horse crippler, you're going to get some cool bees going to your horse crippler as well. So cacti are great for bees as well. And you'll notice some particular relationships between bees and certain plants. So I've mostly noticed these centrus bees, which are called oil-bearing bees, that's the upper left here, going to manzanita, or the wild crepe myrtle plant, Malpighia glabra. The only other plant I've really noticed them go to a lot is rhatany, which is Cremeria something, starts with an R. Thank you. And then Exomelopsis bees, like the super abundant silverleaf nightshade. So silverleaf nightshade grows in huge patches along roadsides. It's a beautiful flower. And you can see some really cool little bees going to just silverleaf nightshade. I already talked about Mexican feather-tongue bees on passion flowers. The feather-tongue bees also like to go to milkweeds, and I've also seen them go to the nightshades as well. And then turret bees, this genus Melitoma, like going to Ruelias and morning glories, and they like hanging out in the tubular corollas. So it's fun to add different plants to your landscape and start to notice that different bees are going to these different resources and learning those associations. All right, what about for birds? We're, of course, one of the most birdy regions in the US. If we were considered a state, we'd be the 8th most species-rich state for birds. So that's pretty impressive. We've seen about 3/4 of all the birds documented in all of Texas, just in our 4 counties. So we're a great place for birds. And there's a lot of cool plants that you can use for birds too. Some super common and easy to work with, like Turk's cap, is absolutely fantastic for hummingbirds in particular. This is one that you go out and grab some fruit, let the fruit dry, and then kind of peel off the pulp and the dried skin, and then just throw it in a pot. You'll get some Turk's cap coming up. So you can grow it on your own. And once you establish one in your yard, it's going to spread as well. And you can kind of work with it. It'll be in partial shade. It'll be in full sun. And you can trim it back if you need to. Scarlet sage is another one. Super common, super abundant. And again, once you get like 1 or 2 in your yard, it's going to spread on its own as well. So smaller hummingbirds like the ruby-throated hummingbird and black-chinned hummingbird seem to like this plant a bit. Coral bean is a tree, small tree, and they mostly bloom in spring and summer. So they're not going to go throughout the year like the Turk's cap and like the scarlet sage. But hummingbirds also really love the coral bean flowers as well. So plant those. You're probably going to have a buff-bellied hummingbird hanging out in your yard. And if you look closely here at the top, that yellowish powder is all pollen that's stuck to its forehead there. So it's doing a fantastic job of pollinating. And this one was just taking a quick break to scratch and preen. You can also plant almost anything with fleshy fruits or berries, also great for birds. So again, if you put have an aqua tree in your yard, you are going to get an incredible diversity of birds potentially. Things like kiskadee up here, things like northern mockingbird, plain chachalaca, various orioles, clay-colored thrush, kingbirds, waxwings, thrashers. The list goes on and on. They absolutely all love the Anaqua fruits. Some other good ones, Berlandier's fiddlewood is like a large shrub to a small tree. Bonus for the fiddlewood, and I'll mention that species again later, is that it's also fantastic for pollinators. So there's a lot of overlap sometimes where you put something in and the flowers are great for pollinators and then the fruits are great for birds. Brazil is a tree as well. This one, just one word of advice is it's super thorny. And so I would put it in a spot that's away from places where you regularly are walking or have kids running around. But it's a great background plant to have. The fruits are also edible by people. Granjeno with the orange fruits on the left there, fantastic. Another one that's pretty easy to grow where you can just take a fruit, don't even wait for it to dry necessarily, and put it in a pot and you can get Granjeno to come up. So just grab a handful next time, throw them in a 1-gallon pot, see what happens, and you'll probably get some Granjeno. Coma is great as well, and it's also one of my favorite smelling trees when it goes into bloom. So it's a wonderful aromatic one, and it kind of can be pruned to look like a classic lollipop tree. So HEBs will use this in their parking lot fairly regularly. Non-trees, snail seed vine is, sometimes people consider it kind of a weedy species. It's a very fast-growing vine that goes everywhere, but I've seen a lot of birds eating those fruits. I've seen kiskadees and mockingbirds and things. And then pigeonberry is a great one if you have some shaded space that you need to fill in with a low-growing plant. They do fine in shade. They probably actually prefer shade because they seem to get really wilty in the summer heat. One thing to keep in mind, especially for birds, but just in general, is the more structural diversity you have in your space, the more niches you're creating for wildlife, right? So if you just have, say, this tree, you're going to have things that like to be in tree canopies. But if you add some shrubbery below it, ground covers and mid-story plants, you're going to be adding spaces for species that prefer to be lower to the ground. So adding that structural diversity is good. Have a tree, have some shrubs, have some ground covers. More diversity, the better. And another thing to keep in mind for birds is that if it's good for insects, it's good for birds, right? Because many birds are eating insects or feeding insects to their young. I know Anne is here. This was one of my formative memories, Anne, as an undergrad, was going around and it was the Goolsbys and Anne Vasek here, and we vacuumed street trees in McAllen, and then they went back and identified them because there's no way I could identify those. But basically what we found is that native trees were better for arthropod diversity and abundance, right? And so things like Texas ebony or anaqua or retama or huizache all were great for insect diversity and therefore are going to be good for birds diversity. Butterflies. We also have a ton of butterfly species here in the valley, over 300. And with butterflies, you have to consider both host plants and nectar plants. So host plants are the plants that these butterflies have to lay their eggs on in order for their caterpillars to eat, right? And sometimes it can be very specific. Classic example is with monarch butterflies, right? They need milkweeds in order to lay their eggs and for their caterpillars to eat. And in our area, we don't have a ton of milkweeds in the Asclepias genus, which are the ones that they particularly like. So we have about 5 species of that. These are monarchs on the Asclepias venothyroides, which is the Zizotes milkweed, which is our really common one that grows in roadsides and whatnot. But when they're adults, there are many different nectar resources that they'll go to. These are all ones here in the valley. Oh, I'm sorry, there's some that are not from the valley, but these are all plants that monarchs have been observed nectaring off of, many of which are here in the valley. So for host plants, sometimes you have to be very specific for certain butterflies, but for nectar plants, a lot of times there's a lot of different things that will go to one plant species. So let's talk about host plants. What are some host plant winners? Things in the bean family are awesome host plants. These are all the butterflies in our area that host on things in the bean family. So these are things like mesquite and Texas ebony and snout beans and indigos and all sorts of different beans that range from trees to shrubs to ground covers. So things like sulfurs, things like longtails, things like Clytie mini-streak, ladies, pixies, and blues are all going to be hosting on things in the bean family. So if you put some beans in, you're probably going to have some of these butterflies. Grasses are actually really great host plants for a lot of butterflies as well. So there's an entire group of butterflies called the grass skippers. And as the name implies, they host on grasses. So if you have some native grasses in your yard, you'll probably get some of these. And then the South Texas satyr is the oddball here, where it's not a grass skipper, but it also hosts on grass as well. So some native grasses, and some of the seeds that I brought are of native grasses. So again, feel free to take some. Mallows are also great host plants. We have a lot of different mallow species as well. You're going to get a lot of different skippers on these. And then things in the acanthus family are also really good. So things like your rewelias or wild petunias, the little tube tongues that frequently grow in people's lawns, those are great plants. Just work around them. And then rarer things like the Texas shrimp plant and the Runyon's water willow are also in that family as well. Some popular nectar plants for butterflies are things in the Verbena family. So Texas lantana is fantastic. It's a classic. Velvet lantana, brushland lantana, and then whitebrush. All these are in the Verbenaceae family, and they're all beautiful shrubs that are great for butterflies. The brushland lantana is really drought tolerant too. So it's going to allow you to get away with not giving it a whole lot of water, but it's going to want full sun or close to full sun. And then whitebrush smells fantastic. And a lot of times when you buy local honeys, they'll mention whitebrush as one of the nectar plants or pollen plants. So a lot of things in the Verbena family are great. So that includes that Berlandier's fiddlewood tree that I mentioned before. That includes things like these frog fruits, which are a ground cover plant. And then of course it includes the lantanas and things like that. It also includes Mexican oregano. So if you want to have some homegrown Mexican oregano to use in the kitchen, you can also be providing for butterflies and bees at the same time. Some specific species I wanted to mention as well is tenaza, which is a small tree. People that are into butterflies will tell me that they'll just go and stand at a tenaza tree that's in bloom and just watch for all the butterflies that come to it. So they're really popular with butterflies, and they bloom usually, I think, at least twice a year around rainy periods. And then buttonbush with these huge white, like puffball flowers. They're also a great plant for butterflies, but they like to have a wet foot. So they like to be in pretty moist soils. And then of course I wouldn't be covering it properly if I didn't mention that a lot of the mist flowers are really great for butterflies as well. So Crucita on the left, blue boneset on the right, betony leaf mistflower on the left, and pink thoroughwort on the right. And what's cool is that if you put just these 4 species, you're going to have nectar available for butterflies almost any time of year. So you could just have a mistflower patch and have your butterflies covered for a nectar source for a while. I do want to mention that there is a great resource for figuring out when things bloom for when you are planning your garden. iNaturalist, I'm on there a lot, and I started a project documenting when different plants go into bloom, and we're already up to almost 27,000 observations in this, so it's a pretty big data set. And what it shows you when you look through iNaturalist at these different species, you can see when they bloom throughout the year. So like Texas thistle, you can see that it's mostly a spring bloomer in March and April and a little bit into May. Whereas the Mexican wing crownbeard, or sometimes it's called frostweed, is mostly, it has a lot of blooms in the fall and winter, and then some in the spring as well. So when you're planning your garden and you want to have floral resources available for your bees and your butterflies at different times of year, this is a great resource to figure out when these different things are going to be in bloom. And I wanted to close up on a kind of a call to action here. This was an article that came out in the Christian Science Monitor that had the stat that over 40 million acres of US land is dedicated to lawns. And to put that in comparison, that's about 13 lower Rio Grande Valleys worth of grass. It's about 1/4 the size of Texas. And it's about 1/10 of an acre per US resident is just going towards this sort of grassy space. And it's also using up a significant amount of our water resources as well. This is a paper in the Texas Water Journal that estimated that about almost half of urban water use just goes to watering grass-dominated spaces. So not only is the grass not really providing that much for wildlife, yeah, there might be some butterflies that host on it here or there, probably not too many, but there's no floral resources in there and it's using up water. So why not try to turn this into something more like this, right? Where we're having these plants that are not only adding some diversity and aesthetic beauty to our spaces, but then they're also providing for wildlife as well. So we can really make a big difference for ourselves and for the life that we share our spaces with by using native plants and thinking about how we can continue to use them in other spaces in our urban areas as well. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions. And we can go ahead and get the lights. So is there any questions I can answer? And I'm also happy to go and call up some of these websites and show you all on the screen if you want me to, but they're all there. I can go back in the PowerPoint and show you individual slides as well. But yes, Tammy.
How do you prove manzanita? Like mine is all lady where it's the bottom, lady is ugly. And finally I got some trees.
You had to ask me a question I don't know the answer to, Tammy. I don't know that much about like trimming and maintenance care for these native plants. My current strategy mostly is just getting things to grow, and then I'm going to figure it out as I go. So like with that Cowpen Daisy I'm just going to see how long it grows. And then once it dies, I'll yank it out, and then we'll see what comes up from seed next growing season. So for the manzanita, what I will say is I have seen it, and the Native Plant Project people are welcome to answer this question too, but I have seen it pruned kind of as a hedge before. You can kind of keep it as a low to medium sized hedge. And I've also seen it kind of almost pruned up to be a small tree as well. There's one in someone's yard that I've been to that is like 10 to 12 feet tall. And then there's also some variety of it that's a ground cover too. So I would experiment a little bit with it and see what you can get it to go to. So sorry not to be able to directly answer your question there.
Not pretty at the bottom, but it's so pretty at the top. And then I figured like cut the top, put it leaf out and fill out on the bottom, or that's
I don't think that's generally how that works with shrubs. So it sounds like the answer that I was hearing from Ken there was you can go do a more severe cutback, and then it'll come back from that stem tissue and that root tissue. Yes, sir.
Do you have a general idea of what your soil composition is like for these native plants?
That's another thing that I'm not super knowledgeable on is the soil types. But in some of these local resources and then the Wildflower Center page, they're going to give you kind of the general soil information as well. And then as you're driving around, if you're going to like collect roadside seed or something, kind of just note where you are and look at what the soil is. So you can like see if it's sandy soil. And then, you know, if you're in like the mid valley, like here in Weslaco or in parts of McAllen, you're not going to have sandy soil. Doesn't mean it won't necessarily, it doesn't mean it won't grow, but it might not grow as well. Right. So if you go onto iNaturalist, you can like look at photos and kind of glean, and you can also see on spatially on a map where observations of it are from. But you know, just be aware that there are spatial biases with iNaturalist too. Yes.
Do you do any work with cities utilizing
We are trying to do more of that in McAllen. Parks and Rec has actually pretty recently done some pretty good stuff with adding a lot of native plants to different areas. They added a lot of trees along Southern Bicentennial, and there's this little frontage road park that they planted a lot of stuff in. And then I think they're putting things near Morris School as well. And then at Quinta, we're currently working on 3/10 of an acre, what we're calling a tiny forest at Cacti Middle School. And we're also working on 2/10 of an acre tiny forest off of Ware Road in McAllen. So we're trying to do more and more outside of Quinta's gates and do it out in the community. Absolutely. Because there's a lot of benefits to having more habitat and more trees around. Any other questions or comments or anything? All right. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And then, yeah, please do. There's envelopes over there. Some of them are not named, but I'll go over there and try to point out what they are to folks. And you can just grab a cluster and throw it in a dirt patch and see what pops up.
Thank you, John. That was an excellent program.
Thank you.
I just have a few announcements before we break up and you start to socialize. The native plants that are along the side here are, well, they're offered by a lot of different people, but Ken King is going to be having them every meeting. We do ask for a donation because the price of these seedlings has gone up. And so, you know, whatever you can offer, we greatly appreciate it. The other thing is that we're going to be selling Mike Heap's native plants at the Birding Festival in Harlingen. And that's going to happen November 10th through November 13th. So please come out and see our booth there. And if any of you would like to volunteer to help at the booth, just contact one of us, the board members, because we need volunteers to help with that too. The other thing is, I wanted to mention that our speaker for October will be Dr. Hudson Dio. He is a professor at UTRGV in the School of Earth, Environment, and Marine Sciences. And he'll be presenting a program about seagrasses and mangroves. And I don't think we've ever had a program like that. So I think it should be very interesting. Thanks again, John. And thank you all for coming out tonight.